We have a vitamin D, it's not up there, some good energy, because it's after lunchtime. And I know that this is probably true for everyone here, that I understand that I could listen to every one of these speakers all day, taking in so much, and so appreciative for everyone who's given already, and everyone who's gonna be sharing now, instead of rather downstairs. So we've heard this morning how communities are using and applying the labels. And this afternoon, we're going to learn and hear a little bit more about the technology behind the labels and their application. We've also heard about archives, museums, and genomics and genetics data. And this next panel will do some work to connect stuff. Right? Connect these areas of work, these areas of application, and the technical infrastructures needed for that application. And we're going to start with a little free report and then go into the
library's technology team, and I work with a variety of applications with focus on digital scholarly software. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that Dartmouth is located on the unceded ancestral lands of the Abenaki Nation, and that much of the capital used to found Dartmouth was obtained with the help of Samson Occam, a Mohegan minister, whose contributions have never been fully acknowledged. Today, I'd like to share my experience working in local context to develop an integration between the local context hub and ArcGIS, an open source application used to manage archival and manuscript collections. Before I talk about some of the details of the integration, I'd like to describe why we started down this path. Dartmouth Library and the Good Museum are recipients of Melody, Advancing Pathways for Long-Term Collaboration. The grant aims to advance significant cross-institutional and community-centered collaboration grounded in Dartmouth's Native American and Indigenous archive collections. Integrating the local context labels and notices and partnering with communities to identify and return to control materials was identified as a key part of the collaboration the grant aims to foster and encourage. Like many institutions, Dartmouth's collections are quite broad, and we hold a variety of material related to Indigenous communities. These include a significant collection related to the Abenaki, as well as a large set of older collections, some of which contain dwelling material related to the Indigenous peoples of the Arctic and Antarctic regions. We have sound recordings, imagery, and other ethnographic data that should be reviewed by the communities represented in the material, so that we can identify material for control to be returned to that community. I also want to talk a bit about my journey as I developed this integration. When I first started working on the integration, the hub was still being developed, and I somewhat naively assumed the workflows and applications like Mukatu were the best examples of how to use labels and notices. Because that seemed straightforward, I created an initial proof of concept and then demonstrated that to the local context team. That first meeting was my first real introduction to complexities involved in managing Indigenous rights, and made me realize that many of my earlier assumptions were too simplistic, and that I needed to learn a lot more about how these processes were intended to work before creating true integration. It also became apparent that the hub was going to be key to any future work, and that I needed to understand that pretty thoroughly before doing any further development. Of course, that first meeting led to many others as our collaboration grew and resulted in the integration that I'll be discussing today. Before I move on to specifics, I want to mention a couple of people that were key to that collaboration. Ashley and Deanna, who saw my messages all too frequently in their inboxes. I also want to thank Corey Rowe and the rest of the local context team for extending the invitation to participate in the summit. ArcGIS is an open source tool to be used to manage and describe archival and manuscript collections. It provides a static interface for data entry management and a public interface, PUI, for discovery. It uses DAX for its descriptive metadata, but also provides mappings to other metadata schemas like EAD and log. It can be integrated with other applications. We've integrated with Preservica, a digital preservation application, and Omnis, a records management system, among others. To give everyone a bit more familiarity with the way we work with archival manuscript collections, here are a couple of views of a typical collection. The top left image shows you a hierarchical tree view of the collection, while the other images show some additional detail about the collection. The first level of the collection is referred to as resource, while the additional sub-levels are archival objects, which can be labeled to indicate how they fit into the collection hierarchy. This illustrates one of the key differences between describing archival and manuscript collections and single object description like you typically find in a standard catalog from museum. The context of an object in an archival or manuscript collection is critical. Here's a real-world example. We have a file called Pound, assert 1912 to 1962. That might be interesting by itself, but when you see the full hierarchy, you learn that this is in the Robert Frost papers, and that it's subject files, and that it contains an undated draft of letter in pencil, presumably to Kathleen Morris, regarding Ezra Pound and Frost's involvement in Pound's incarceration in a mental institution. So even more interesting. The public interface, or PUI, presents a similar view to the public, and I'm showing you our very customized version of that here. Again, you have that hierarchical tree view that is so crucial for understanding the context of the object you're currently viewing. The PUI also provides information on citation elements, how to set up a request to view the object, and how to request copies. Those are the images on the front. Archive space can be customized by adding or overriding functionality with plugins, which interact with or override the core application to provide that extra or changed functionality. When I create a new plugin, I always create it with community sharing in mind. I try to take our local needs and generalize those to suit a wider audience. If a plugin has widespread adoption, it can also be incorporated into the core code. This helps provide that extra functionality to smaller institutions or institutions that use a hosted version of archive space. I've included some examples of plugins that we use and broken them out into the different types of functionality. The local context plugin provides staff users with the ability to link an object to archive space with a local context hub project using the API provided by local context. The hub project ID is the unique identifier that we use to link the two applications. Resources, accessions, archival objects, and digital object components can all be linked to the project. Once linked, the local context labels, notices, and other data associated with the project will be displayed in the archive space, both in the staff interface and the PUI. I'll note that all of the data you see in this presentation comes from the development API. There are a lot of placeholders and lorem ipsum used to demonstrate functionality. All archive space users can view existing local context projects, but need elevated permissions to manage them. This is a view of what a user might see in archive space with the standard options that archive space provides for any list or server view. From the overall list of local context projects, you can view the details for a specific project. In addition to the standard basic details and linked record lists, you can also choose to view the local context data. Labels and notices data is formatted from the display, but the entirety of the API data is also viewable raw JSON. The local context data view is toggled by the See Local Context Data button. The linked records portion of this view shows which objects in archive space have been linked to this project. Here are some examples of what the staff view looks like if you look at the local context data. On the left side are the basic project details and the labels and notices for this project. On the right is the raw JSON data. A label can include translations into one or more languages. If translations are available, then there's an additional file to view those translations. Translations are displayed with the title and the language the translation is in. If there's an audio file associated with the label or notice, that audio file is also rendered in line in the native browser audio tag. Local context data presented in archive space is fetched from the hub on an ongoing basis and cached locally to prevent overloading the API. The caching times are configurable, but you'll want to work with the local context team if you change those from the default values, since we work to define times that we anticipate will work with the majority of use cases. Each time a local context project's data is viewed in archive space, the plugin checks the locally cached copy to see if it's out of date. If it is, the plugin fetches an updated version of the data from the hub API. If the data is still fresh, then the plugin displays the data from the cached copy. In addition to the automatic cache refresh, you can choose to refresh the cache for a specific project or all project manually. Those options are accessible from the same page as the list of all projects. It's unlikely that you'll need to refresh all projects manually, since the plugin automatically refreshes all project data on an ongoing basis. How do we go about linking a local context project to a record? Archive Space provides a standard metric adding additional data to a record, and the plugin follows that standard workflow. You can add a local context project subrecord to resources, sessions, archival objects, and digital object components, and then use the standard type to find and link to a specific project. You can add more than one project subrecord to any object, but in practice, I think that would be extremely rare. Once you've added a project subrecord and exited the enter, you can view the project details. This view is the same as what you've seen on the project itself, with formatted labels and notices, and a view of raw JSON data. The plugin enhances the archive space public user interface, PUI, as well. It adds the labels and notices images for the linked project, just under the record type. Each image is linked to a full label or notice text in the body of the record. The body of the record adds a new subsection, which includes the label and notice details, a link to the project on the local context hub, and any translations of the labels and notices. Labels details also include the name of the community responsible for the label. Because archive-based presents data in a hierarchical context, we needed to design a system for inheriting linked project data down that hierarchical tree. To solve that, we came up with some simple rules. Linked project data is inherited down the tree unless an object is itself linked directly to a project. Objects that inherit project data details display those with a link to the object the project data is inherited from. Here's a concrete illustration of what that inheritance display of PUI looks like. A series has a project linked. It has two child files. One file is directly linked to a project different from the series. The file without a directly linked project displays the information inherited from the series with a note and link to the parent series. The file directly linked to a project just displays that directly linked project data. The Open to Collaborate notice is a special case since it's something that an institution can choose to display independent of a specific project. If you choose to enable this notice, you'll first want to add the notice to your account on the context hub. Once you do, you can update the configuration and the notice will display on the PUI homepage. The plugin also includes the local context data in staff and PUI exports. Here are some examples of what that exported data looks like. Staff side PDF export on the left and a sample EAD export on the right. Note that these both include a link to view the project data on the local context hub, as well as the date that the export was created on. This is useful if you've got an old export and the local context project details may have changed in the meantime. You always have a way to see the current labels and notices for any project. It also indicates to the reader this is a static snapshot of data change. The mappings for the EAD and EAD pre-exports is tentative, and I'm working with the local context team and others to finalize. MARC exports are also planned, and I'm working with the local context team and the technical implementation working group to provide a default mapping of that schema as well. The plugin is available on GitHub and works with archive-based versions 3.11 up to 3.3.1. I plan to continue to provide support for the plugin for future archive-based releases, and have begun to think about ways this might be implemented in the core application. Pull requests, future requests, or comments are encouraged, since we're hoping that this meets the archive-based community's needs. Finally, thank you for listening. Here's my contact information if anyone would like to get in touch, discuss the integration in more detail, or as ideas for enhancements. I hope everyone enjoys the rest of the summer.
Good afternoon. I'm still Darren Ranko. Donation to the chair neighborhood programs of the University of Maine. I'm joined by my colleague Andy here.
Hi, I'm Andy Rominger. We're going to share this presentation with you.
Yeah. Really work this out. So. I want to say a little bit about where this part of our work came from. Obviously, I shared this MOU, and there's a lot of process at the University of Maine in terms of tribal collaborations. This came out of, pretty far along the line of those collaborations and in the slight aftermath of the MOU that I referenced before. There was beginning in 2019, during 2018, we were applying for an NSF grant through the NSF EPSCOR program, which is the sorry, I brought it up on my phone. Score is the established program to stimulate competitive research. It's one of the larger NSF research and development grants. It only goes to states that don't get their fair share of certain R&D monies from the National Science Foundation. So Maine is one of those states. The theme chosen for that year is statewide grant, but the main score office that is housed at the R1 institution, which is our campus. In the theme of that, it has every 5 years, these grants have a theme. The theme for this one that started in 2019 is it was eDNA, environmental DNA. And into that, I had already worked with some PIs to have our youth science program, the Wabanaki Youth Science program, which uses two-eyed seeing for Indigenous science education. It's a really great middle and high school post-secondary Indigenous science education program. We wanted to bring Indigenous partnerships into the environmental DNA context. And we just basically said, we'll explore those in the grant. I think probably the benchmarks of like present eDNA to these communities, do this kind of work. And then we also said we wanted to do trainings for around Indigenous science and research ethics around Indigenous peoples within the context of eDNA. Very early on, and part of the Mexico grants is they bring in new faculty into institutions focused on these particular frameworks. Andy is one of those hires, correct? Yes. And so he's a specialist in this area of research. Where we went from like 0 to whatever level this you'll hear here, which is, I don't know, 30 miles an hour. Happened very quickly, partly because of an influx of new faculty like Andy. We did a training for graduate students around research ethics and environmental DNA, and basically just how do you do research in Indigenous territories, like 101. And the grad students were like, people who do environmental things, they're like, how do we do this? Like, we need to know more. And so they kept pushing and pushing. And then the faculty were like, well, there are these frameworks out there for ethical, this connection between fair and care. We'll talk about these things. And ultimately they were just like, Darren, how do we do this? And I was like, I don't know, I'll call Jane. So then I called Jane. I was like, we're doing this whole thing, like, I know that there's a discussion. I heard a presentation about the HRO Maori context that this was being done, but I had no idea about it. One of the biggest, because of our established partnerships, and the interest of this emergent set of relationships and MOUs, we were able to articulate a whole paradigm of study where we were no longer seeing the entirety of our region as just a blank space, but Indigenous territory. So we had that framework already. And because we have research and other kinds of relationship with our tribal and historic preservation officers at each of the tribal nations, we were able to kind of build partnerships relatively quickly and solve some of the bugaboos that would pretty quickly that might be challenging in other institutional contexts. Then I'll hand it over to Andy. That's all.
Great. Okay, I'll take this one.
Okay.
All right, here we go. So yeah, thanks, Darren, for setting that up, and I want to start by thanking all of our partners in this, who include the tribal historic preservation officers, so many folks at enrich and local context, working with Native Land Digital for a little while, and then our collaborators at University of Maine. And the slides you'll see are kind of put together by these folks. And I didn't know, that arrow points to me, I didn't know if I was going to be on that side or this side. So. All right, so the way I want to talk about this is two parallel narratives. And, of course, they feed back on each other. But because I'm so brainwashed by the Western tradition, I'm going to linearize this feedback and start with the technical implementation. How we put into our database, into our workflows. The biocultural notices on our end as a research institution. And then use that as a scaffolding to talk about the relationships that we built. And are continuing to build. All right, that's what those lines and dots mean, but I skipped that part. Okay, so our technical implementation. As Darren mentioned, this is a big, this one of these big grants, and it gave us money to sample all of it down the coast of what is now Maine. Those dots are the sampling points, and Darren and I put this map together to overlay those points on the traditional territory. Just again, as a reminder of where we are and what we're doing. So just a tiny bit of detail about what we're doing. So this eDNA idea is that we all shed DNA into the environment, organisms shed DNA into the environment. A person or a group of people could sample that, process it in the lab, sequence the DNA, and get some sense of what diversity is there, biological diversity is there. Recognizing that this is being done on Indigenous homelands, the idea is to intervene in what is typically just a pure settler process, to have a decolonial intervention in that by placing these notices on the digital and physical samples of the research. So technically how we do that, or getting a little more technical, before we go in the field and when we're in the field, we have an app that we use called Survey 123, which is served by Esri. And we also can go into local context and make a project. Then we can link those to entering the unique identifier into Survey 123. So we go and collect the sample, we bring it back to the lab, process it in the lab, which looks like extracting the DNA and then putting the DNA extract in a freezer to preserve it for potential future uses, as well as the physical sample, which is water that's been passed through a very, very fine filter to catch all of the DNA on it. And then we sequence it. Okay, the sequencing data and the environmental metadata that we collected in the field, what that looks like is just dumping everything into a very, very well designed database. And I'm putting these BC notices at all the spots where we either want to or currently are able to put one of these tags. So then open repositories is ultimately where the terms of the NSF grant mandate that these data go. So the dream is to have the notice ultimately labels propagate forward with the data. Then one of the final outputs is various types of reports that we would be producing. So reports to partners, education materials, peer-reviewed manuscripts. And I just want to highlight in the pink that these two, the peer-reviewed manuscripts and the open repositories, are things outside of our control presently. And of course, that's, I think, a big topic of what folks are thinking about here, of how to move our efforts forward into those spaces. All right, so just some examples. Here's what that Survey 123 app looks like. So this is literally all of our field techs take this on their phone into the field. It has a land acknowledgement on there. And it has, like I said, the ability to link to a pre-existing local context project. So it's not automated, like you have to type in that long old unique identifier. More on that in a second. This QR code will take you to our web portal for our database. And what you'll see is we have the open to collaborate notice on there. And then on the actual data record, same QR code, data record, the notice sits as well. And critically, like Joshua's talk, this is automated. This is automated. So pulled via the API to populate our local database. And of course, that's important, that automated API update, because the whole purpose of the notice is to be replaced by a label. And you want to then be able to update your database with that information. And the reason you want to update that information is because when a user goes to your database and downloads the data, you want them to have the most current and relevant information about Indigenous sovereignty and governance of those data. All right, so this is currently what we're able to do, and this has been in large part implemented by a graduate student, Melissa Kimball, who was perhaps greatly underpaid for her skill set and being able to develop all this stuff. But we'll get a little more into the relationship building part in a second. Okay, so just to say, you know, this is not specific to our one group, but just to kind of repeat the refrain that I think a lot of us are thinking of is that this is great to have this accomplishment, but we still want to be able to push it forward into these more typical final destinations for this type of biological research, which would be peer-reviewed publications and these big open online repositories. And again, currently it's not. Well, you know, the mechanisms are not there. But it's been really a very cool experience that I'm grateful to have had to be invited into this group in this space to start thinking about ways to do that, to have a meeting with the NCBI higher ups to try to put pressure on them to adopt this, the notices and labels. That's hopefully we continue to make progress. All right, so that's been the technical implementation. I just want to do a couple of highlights on the relationship building. So of course, the first, like Darren mentioned, was that, you know, in this project, we were asking Darren, overtaxing Darren probably about what are we supposed to do with all this, and Darren opened up this relationship and collaboration with Jane and Natalie. And in part, this was in a class that I taught with Darren Gray on community engaged science, which was a cool thing to do. And shout out to Aaron for that. And so Beth Davis was here and Jen Smith Mayo were students in that class and really took this project on and really made a lot of the advancements that we see. So of course, relationship building had to occur with the tribes as well. And thanks to the MOU, and thanks to Darren, thanks to Jane, having worked with tribal historic preservation officers for the Wabanaki Nations and what is now Maine, this was, you know, yeah, I think a lot more fruitful than they could have otherwise been. One interesting story is about asking representatives of the tribal nations, asking the Timbos, how do you want us to communicate about these data that come from your lands? And being, you know, kind of, you know, Western scientists, being geospatial people, we got a little bit perhaps overly fixated and obsessed with, oh, these boundaries that we can pull from. Do I have it? Yeah, we can pull from you know, the nativeland.ca website with their API. We can pull these boundaries, we can overlap them with our sites, we can make unique projects for every combination of every overlap, and you know, but then someone thankfully just said we should just ask the Timbos how they want this to be done. And they said, we want to know about everything that's happening in this territory. Just tell us everything.
That was me.
Yeah.
I know this sounds stupid. But yeah, and I think well, what occurs in across our tribal nations, across the tribal historic preservation officers, who, if you don't all know, like they have as sovereign nations, we have a role in historic preservation decisions, designations, and there's probably a master class somewhere on all that if you don't know that word. But they are used to being notified by, for example, the federal government or the Park Service or whoever, when something is happening in our lands, and they had already set up a protocol with various federal entities to all be notified at once around, you know, the highway that's being built or the park that's being extended or whatever. And they have, as well, not be tribal nations, we have our own internal protocol as to who puts eyes on things, and they had already worked that out. I mean, and the idea that we had to ask, and that we were like trying to go into the nativelands.ca and be like, hey, your line isn't quite right over there, and you should probably, you know, and you know, the idea of mapping indigenous territory into some clear boundary is problematic and challenging for all the ways that you probably all suspect. But that level of asking, and so that dialogue of having protocols already established through tribal entities that represent tribal and cultural interests, and we had already formulated and if you're not aware of what eDNA research looks like and why the tribes might even be interested in it, it's because it can give both a contemporary and historic take on species distribution and concentrations. So it has a lot of work, applicable work related to ecological restoration, management issues that are hugely important to our tribes. So the idea that this is that formulation of why they're even interested in this, and you see that in terms of the species management issues in New Zealand, with the Maui as well. So that, and then the protection of certain locations became very important as well. That so this approach, the TIPO kind of approach, is to protect sacred sites, protect sites of particular interest. And one of the next technical problems, I can't even talk about it, is this prior approval, or at least it's vetting of site data, which sites are being collected eDNA data. And it's similar to our MOU where we're like, that's a culturally sensitive object. There are going to be culturally sensitive places that will be no-go for data collection in eDNA because of particular tribal protocols that want to protect those sites. That's my next. I'm trying to preempt the next relational question.
Well, I may not have had a slide for that.
That's all right.
But my sixth one. Yeah, that's all I need. But the timing was another issue, right? That there are not only certain sites, but certain times at certain sites.
Yes.
And so this, I literally got an email yesterday there from Sean O'Neill that we finally now are able to share our proposed sampling schedule with the TIPROs and get feedback on should we adjust that to respect any kind of, no-goes. Okay, let's see. All right, there was relationship building with the users as well to try to, promote uptake and adoption of this. I think the most effective thing we did was added language to our training manuals for undergrads and grads talking about this. Less so effective with the older folks, but they're not the ones in the field anyway. But an interesting question that we had was, when they're out in the field with this app, do we want to make it a little bit challenging or in some way introduce some kind of friction in engaging with recognizing where they are, such that they really pause to think, oh, this is where I am, this is what I'm doing. These are the indigenous lands I'm on, or waters. Or do we make it as frictionless as possible so that everyone adopts it? If you have to, go through too many clicks, you're not going to do it. What's more valuable, the learning or the documentation of the provenance and rights? It turns out we couldn't really do either because we're using this closed source thing, but it speaks to, I think, future opportunity to write new software for field data entry and then address this question at that point. And then the last relationship I'll talk about is with F-score. So everything we did here, from the limited amount of tweaking we could do on closed source tools to the application of the notices, ultimately had to get approved by the F-score office. And I think mostly echoes people's experience so far. There's some fear about ceding control of a data resource that $20 million went into producing. However, for us, it seemed to be overcome by all the radical leftists.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
A lot of friends.
Yeah. But I think there really was the majority of the sentiment was enthusiasm for engaging in this new protocol.
Yeah, and also because this wasn't pre-designed with the grant either, right? So this is an opportunistic, like, we didn't put biocultural notices in the eDNA grant. We didn't contemplate it. So part of, for the leadership, you know, the lead PI, things like, will any of this violate, you know, what we agreed to deliver at SF, but in terms of the open sourcing and all of that, and so they had to do that. I mean, next time, right, it will go in the next seed, and we've applied for other grants, you know, that it will be structured from the very beginning. That's very critical.
All right. That's all I got.
That's good, okay.
There we go. So I'm deeply appreciative prior to talks and what happened this morning. So I can launch into a little bit more high level abstract discussions about what the hub looks like. And my technical perspective on this. And this is really, I just want to clarify that this is really from the lens of a field researcher, someone who's out there collecting things, and possibly an institutional perspective. I'm a lot more familiar with working directly with researchers myself. So just a little bit about me. I'm kind of involved in a lot of different areas. I'm a data curator at Berkeley Natural History Museums. I'm also the creator of the Genomic Observatory's metadatabase. I've worked on adaptive ontologies for annotating data sources. I'm also a livestock farmer, so a little bit, you know, like sense of place, and, you know, what goes on in a particular environment. I'm fortunate to manage 320 acres in Oregon's Willamette Valley. So I have to, you know, that's kind of like when I seize my land base personally there. Another aspect, which I didn't put up here, but is really as I see myself as the technical architect of the hub. And this came about because I was been doing geom and field databases for a long time, and I met Maui and Jane in New Zealand in 2018. And we had a couple strange trips. We were flying and driving across New Zealand, and we were giving these presentations about PK labels. And we were sitting in bars at night while we were traveling through New Zealand, and we were just shooting around ideas about EC labels. And so all the requirements of the hub and what I see and like wanted to build into the framework and the architecture is all infused with several kinds of beer. So some of it might seem a little abstract and weird. But I'm going to go through some points here, and these are somewhat uncoupled and random, but these are the things that kind of came out through this process as we were talking about the system that we wanted to see. It didn't exist. We wanted to create it. It's like, okay, so these are the different points. I'm just going to cruise through these slides. We needed something primarily to elevate credibility for field researchers, and this goes into geom is a data validator for field researchers. You put your data into geom, it's a level of credibility. So here's a set of rules and constructs that I agree to with my project, my collaborators, my funders, and we said we are going to collect data that has these particular attributes. And so geom gatekeep all that data will prevent you from loading data into the system that you say you don't want. So as a label, I really like the idea of labels. And I in my first slide, you can't really see it, but there's a little thing that says GitHub and tax size. And tax size is it's a R package that lives in GitHub. And it has these at the top of the tax size R package, just a random package to look up taxonomic names. There's all these little badges that you see up there, and each badge means something different. And these badges were requested by the creator of the repository. They said, I want this badge up there, but importantly, they don't get to determine the color of the badge. Someone else determines that. So they can, for instance, there's a badge up there saying, is the package built properly? And in this case, it's actually funny. The tax says it took the screenshot and it failed. But there's a machine actually that validates it for them. So if they push their code up there and it's going to try and build it. In this case, it failed. But there's another one called code coverage. And someone else goes to look at how much unit testing did you do on your code. So anybody familiar with coding knows that coders love to test. So if you run a function, does the function do what you think it's going to do? This is like critical. So it'll tell you the code. So I really like this idea of labels from other sources and other parties to help and elevate credibility. One other thing is that we needed to make these really easy to use. You know, you're talking to field researchers, they're busy, they have agendas, they have limited amount of time in the field, and you know, and it was talking about friction. You don't want to have too much friction for a field researcher because they're just going to bypass, not do it. So we wanted to make this, you know, that I put, you know, two columns here: researcher tasks and hub tasks. And hub tasks are all oriented into a black box, right? So mostly the researcher doesn't want to deal with everything that goes on in the hub. They want to go to the hub and request a notice. If I'm going to create a project, they got a notice. I got a project identifier, and I can take that project identifier. And if they're using a tool like Geom or ArchiveSpace or any other tool that talks to the local context hub, all I have to do is associate it with their project. And they're essentially done. Any other labels that come back is the responsibility of the hub. Another thing that's kind of like bent my head about this is that labels are mutable. Mutable is just a fancy way of saying that they're liable to change. They don't necessarily have to change, but they're liable. So, you know, as an example, you have an attribute label here, example attribution. They could change in the text. Here says example attribution with amendments, or it can be removed entirely. So this is critical in terms of the design of something, and we need a dynamic system that can track mutations in the labels themselves. Working with multiple communities, this kind of was a confusing point for me, you know, like in considering how we build a hub, and how with a researcher you go out and research. There might be multiple parts. You know, we talked about this idea that the boundaries are fuzzy, and how do you broker relationships among multiple communities, and that is a tall order for a researcher. It's going to be like, no, I don't want to get involved in that level. The really cool thing is working with the hub. The hub has a team of people that actually handle that aspect for you. It's not incumbent on the researcher. So it's really a great idea as a researcher. I'm going to say, I'm going to go to the hub. Instead of working with communities directly, I'm going to interact solely with the hub. Another aspect here, just in terms of the technical architecture, is that we want to make notices and perhaps labels that could be attached to them later represented by a result from URI. So this is crucial in terms of enabling, you know, the dynamic nature of the network. Here's an example of the URI that has the hub web services, the first part of it, and the second part of this URI is the project identifier. So you type that into the URL of the web browser, or better yet, it could be just embedded in a web page and have the web browser make the request for you. Typically, it's the web browser or some other system makes the request for you that sends it to local context then responds with JSON. This is the machine-to-machine communication data format that describes all the labels you have rendered on a web page. And just a little note, you know, that there's coding back there. Josh, it's like absolutely fantastic that he wrote a plugin for a system for people to implement this. For other developers, actually, an idea I have in my head is to have example scripts and example code that you can easily implement in systems that you can make asynchronous requests. So you can display your page, and as your page is displaying, another request could go on from the background and wait for a response from the hub and display those. Getting into rights. So now I had to look up, we were talking about rights a couple nights ago at dinner. And I was like, what is a right? To go to Wikipedia, you know. So rights can be legal, social, or ethical principles. So I've highlighted social or ethical principles importantly because the labels are not legal, they're not a legal thing. And one thing we've talked about in terms of interacting with standard vocabularies is the Dublin Core rights field, and probably a lot of you are familiar with Dublin Core, describing a set of metadata fields. And this was used in the mainly for the publishing industry, but it's been adopted by a lot of other people. For example, Darwin Core has a rights field, and if you look at Darwin Core, the Darwin Core rights field is actually points to Dublin Core rights. Dublin Core rights describes the broad definition of rights, including people. And for a lot of biodiversity records, it's already popular with legal permit data and other copyright data that's in there. So how do we represent it in the community? And Jane, there's your definition. You asked for a definition. Got it. I wrote it there. A local context identifier represented as a URI. So the local context identifier, this is a proposal for a term. Right now we don't have a scheme or a namespace to put this, but we're going to put the term out there and focus on writing a very clear definition for what we want. And hopefully it gets picked up and then we can sort out where it should live. But a local context identifier represented as a URI, which resolves to a local context project. And then it gives an example. Local context labels describe a set of extra legal rights supporting cultural and biological heritage materials. And then for more information. So that's just an idea about, you know, how can we describe notices and labels in a single term that can be picked up by community standard vocabularies, which allows us to interact with INSCC and other vocabularies and other data repositories across the board. And then finally, this is my last thing, you know, the labels are transitive, and this is not from grammar, it's from logic. You could also say that it's, you know, you can call it inheritance as well. But if you apply a label at the project level, that the labels would apply to all collecting events associated with that project. And a collecting event would yield multiple specimens, and an individual specimen could yield multiple tissues. And each individual tissue could yield multiple sequences, and those sequences can yield publications. So it's important to note that when you apply it at one level, it goes across the entire sequence and chain of derivatives that you normally see in your collecting biological chain. I don't know. I'm going to just go through this last part really quickly because we've already seen an active sample application. It's the Geom homepage. There's an open to collaborate notice put onto the Geom homepage saying, "Hey, Geom itself is, you know, wanting to collaborate." Here's an example project landing page. And this project landing page has a local context identifier underlined in red there. So if you search the data, here's a particular sample with all of the sample metadata attributes. You see a set of labels in the upper right. You can click on the parent event. So what is the collecting event this came from? The collecting event has a map. Here's the location. And then you can see the labels are also applied to the event as well. So if you click on one of the labels, you know, you can go back to the hub itself, and it will tell you about the project. Yeah, that's the end of the story. I think that's all.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me here today. I really appreciate it. I'm Sean Sadler. I am a settler. I'm from Calgary, Alberta, Canada, Western Canada. And I just want to quickly recognize the traditional peoples of Southern Alberta. Specifically the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Tsuut'ina Nations, the Nakota Nations, Métis, and all the people who make their homes on Treaty 7 region of Southern Alberta. So thank you again for having me here today. I am with Working, and if you've not heard of us before, that's okay, because we're still fairly new. We're on the technology side of research. We issue unique IDs to researchers or to people. So to qualify for an ORCID ID, you have to be a human being over the age of 18. So you don't have to be a professional researcher, it can be anyone in the community. So earlier we talked about the community engaged research projects. So even people in the community that are participating who are not officially part of the university can register for ORCID and get credit for their contributions to the research. So it's a really exciting area. And so what we do as the, I'm a performer, so I'm gonna move around a bit. So you can see, so this is an article that Jane and Maui published, I think last year. And you can see Jane included her ORCID ID when she submitted this manuscript to publishers. There's a little green dot by her name. If you were to click on that green dot, it'll take you to Jane's record. And you can see Maui, no green dot. You're gonna have to talk to Maui. So I'm gonna show you my record because apparently Jane and I need to have a party to work on populating her working record. So here's my record. So you can see here is my ORCID ID. It's a 16-digit number here, ending 5304. Just some of the information about me. I've done a few publications. I wouldn't call myself a researcher, but I have worked for universities, published, and presented lots. So what we do with work is we issue that unique ID number to people because there's a few people named Jane Anderson. Not many, now we've had some stuff, but there's a few Janes. And so we know exactly which Jane you are. And then we issue you a record, so you can start populating all your research activities as a professional researcher in this record. And then the third thing we do is we have APIs. We've heard lots about APIs today. To transfer the data between different organizations, different systems. So I'll get into that in a little bit. So some of the systems that we transfer, this is our kind of a fun infographic. So imagine this is Jane, her ORCID ID in the center. And then with her record, all the data that will soon be in her record. We've got the APIs to connect to systems all through the scholarly ecosystem. So you can see we connect to publishers, to funders, universities or people who employ researchers, because researchers have to submit annual reports too. How many papers did you publish last year? Jane, tell us each and every one of them. So what we do is we get publishers. So when Jane sent her ORCID ID to the publisher says, thank you very much, you're now published, they write the citation to her ORCID record for her. So when Jane has to update her annual report for NYU, she can just log into ORCID and we send that data straight through. So Jane doesn't have to re-enter that data. And so funders, universities, and publishers like that because the data flows through very quickly. We've timed it, it's about 40 minutes from the time of requesting the data to go through your ORCID record to the other organization system. This is the data from the originator, and so most of the time that's the accurate data. It's when people re-enter data that mistakes happen. It also interrupts. They've got better things to do than to enter data about the publication from last year, which they might not even remember. So, and then we also, this group here, we also work with lots of different vendors and open source platforms to integrate work into their platforms to help with that data transfer. So, before I get into how local context and ORCID are working together, just a quick little background about ORCID. So we just want to make sure that everyone's really clear. We are a nonprofit organization and we're global and we support researchers in every field. So it's never a dull day at work, I'll tell you that. But we are a nonprofit. We registered about 10 years ago. We just had our 10th anniversary, which is exciting. We do have incredible global adoption and adoption across all subject areas. And the digital humanities is our last. Those humanists, a little resistant to the technologies. That's okay. We're supportive of that. But again, just to reiterate, we're community-based. We have a board based on our members, and then we're researcher focused. That's our goal. We need to support researchers first. So I'll go through that. We do have sibling organizations that we work closely with.
So these cross-referencing data set are also paid providers, they provide some identifiers, and they're also community and nonprofit, community-based and nonprofit organizations. Cross-ref issues unique identifiers mostly to publishers, so for publications, journal articles mostly. They're just starting to provide unique identifiers for funding, so they're working with the funders now too. So when you get an award because your proposal was genius, it will be awarded with unique IDs to reference that specific award. DataCite usually works with data sets, as you can imagine. So when you create your data set from the field work, you can publish it with the unique ID number so it can be clearly identified. Okay, so local contacts have working together for a few years. And so working for big supporters, of course, with the FAIR principles, and it leads us naturally to be supportive of the CARE principles as well. So we're very supportive of DITA and the local context project. We're hoping to be part of that technical infrastructure to help implement and make the CARE principles actionable. So with the development of the local context platform, as researchers say, if you register and you create your profile in local context, you can include your work ID in your profile in the local context platform. So here's a quick screenshot of mine, and I've included my work ID in the local context. You can see I haven't done anything yet, but hopefully that'll change. Now I've been working with some of the people in the local context working group, and we're brainstorming ideas right now. And so so one of the ideas is that in that work record, we collect lots of information about people if you like. There's always other research. But we've got a section for other IDs, and if you'd like, you can include your local context researcher ID in your working record as well. Next, we've got a section for websites and social links. So Rose was able to add local context, looking to collaborate in that section. And so we'll have to work with the team about what the URL is for that, but that's something that's doable if you like. And this is something that local context has proposed to Oregon. I'm not sure how we can do it quite yet, but it's a really great idea. Because in your ORCID record, you can list all your publications. And so wouldn't it be lovely if we can include the labels in that citation? So we kind of think about ORCID, our records tend to be like a really transit station for metadata, going from the originator, if it's an ORCID that usually goes on someplace else to be recycled data. And we use Unicode to inform this data. So we're not sure how to quite, if we can get that graphic in there yet, but you know what, we can think about it, we can figure something out. So we're still, it's early days, but we're working. So I think one of the things we're going to be speaking about soon are the notices, because those are going to be relevant to researchers. And so researchers, possibly who are professional researchers approaching Indigenous communities to conduct research, and then the flip side, also Indigenous communities who want to notice researchers. So we're considering how ORCID can support the adoption of notices in the ORCID record, in the ORCID system. So I think I'm going to redo this infographic, but now I'm back to the local context graphic to Jane in the center here with her ORCID ID. And just thinking about the data that's coming from local context hub in the ORCID record and how that data can get moved to funders, publishers, and institutions. And so I had a bit of a brainstorm. I thought, oh, actually, that could be kind of powerful. Because for the funders, I know the NIH and NSF have Indigenous policies. And they really want researchers to behave themselves. And how do they demonstrate good behavior and due diligence? And there's a possibility that the notices could be part of that. And ORCID, our ORCID records are connected to their forms. So when the researchers have to apply or they have to do an update, they can use the data in their ORCID record to pre-populate it. So maybe some of the local context data should flow through to show good behavior and due diligence. But also with some of the institutional systems, when you do update your annual report to your employer, the research employer, you also have to demonstrate good behavior and due diligence to your employer. The publishers, and I think Jane, you're speaking with some of the publishers now, how that data can flow from local context up into the publishers, and so we can be part of that infrastructure, if you like. And then just working with some of the different vendors out there. There's some pretty big vendors that really like research data, and we got to make sure that they collect it properly and send it through the whole research ecosystem properly too. So we can help there as well. I'll stop there, and if you have questions later, thanks so much.
I'm Marie McDougall. I'm the Vice President of Experience and Engagement at the Academy of Medical Sciences in Philadelphia. My background is as an interdisciplinary curator. Both I'll get kind of switch gears a little bit. I'm going to share with you an exhibition in making. We're in the research development phase, and we've been working closely with local context to develop it. So it's called Body of Nations. I should also just say I'm really honored to participate in this summit. Local context has been amazing. Jane's been a real intellectual partner on the project, and we're just at the beginning of getting on the hub. And so, grateful to the whole crew. And it's just been amazing to learn about what everybody does here. It's interesting to represent my institution as somebody developing exhibitions of public programs, but local context has such huge implications as I'm learning for field work, and also our library and archives. So I kind of wish I had, a lot of my colleagues here, but I'm so happy it's being recorded so I can share it later. So this exhibition, Body of Nations, is planned for 2026, the centennial of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And it aims to center Indigenous knowledges. So just to share a little bit of context, the Academy is considered the first institution of natural sciences of its kind in the Americas. It was founded in 1812 by 6 amateur scientists for the encouragement and cultivation of the sciences and the advancement of useful learning. So this is an image from a project today. 10 years ago, the Academy became affiliated with Drexel University, and under the current leadership, we are in the midst of quite a transformation. Our current approaches include interweaving methods of art and science, as well as embodying the ideals of inclusion, diversity, equity, and access to learning. So, as well as bringing to the fore the Academy's scientific research, collections, library and archives material in relation to cultural dialogues and discourses of our day. This project, which is a decolonizing project, has the endorsement of the Academy's president and CEO, Scott Cooper, as well as our board of trustees, which Jane tells me is quite unusual for many organizations. So we think to be kind of proud. So the Body of Nations exhibition grows out of one of the oldest botany herbariums in the country, a collection of 222 pressed plants that were gathered and pressed during the Lewis and Clark War of Discovery of 1804 to 1806. They're housed at the Academy and combined holdings of both the Academy and the American Philosophical Society. And I should note that I first learned about the work of local context through APS, who works closely with local context. So slide. So American school children learn about the Lewis and Clark War of Discovery at the time of the Louisiana Purchase, as part of a narrative of American expansion and manifest destiny. So this is a National Park Service map showing the route from St. Louis to the Pacific. What they generally don't learn about are the scientific aims of the expedition, or the 50 sovereign nations traversed, and the generous Indigenous guides and leaders that contributed to knowledges to the discovery made. One of the guides that assisted in this project was the Arikara elder Tune, a survivor of epidemics of the 1770s and 1780s that decimated Arikara populations from 4,000 to 500. Tune was a great diplomat who spoke 11 languages and dialects. He agreed to accompany Lewis and Clark to the Mandan and Hidatsa villages, and later accepted an invitation to Washington, D.C. to meet President Jefferson. Despite the grave misgivings against the wishes of his tribe, Tune tragically passed away during the journey in D.C. The map that was passed to a White House chef ended up in the French Bibliothèque Nationale of Paris. And there's a wonderful paper I would recommend to you by Christopher Steinke It's called Here's My Country, and it has this as an interactive map. I think I can share the link if anybody is interested. So the map depicts sacred auricula sites of Turtle Lake, Buffalo Lake, and Medicine Rock. And what's really interesting to do is compare the map with the maps that were produced by Clark and other writings related to the expedition. So what we can see very clearly with this is what was valued and what was not valued. So the things that were valued were geographical details, lakes, swamps, mountains, woods, prairies, roads, things that were useful for navigation, and the things that were dismissed and devalued were Indian place names, landmarks, the historical and religious landscape of Tune's homeland. So just to give you a little overview of Body of Nations, Body of Nations will offer rich counter narratives to the prevailing account of Meriwether Lewis and William Clark's explorer discovery to explore lands west of the Mississippi River, a story that has been foundational to instilling a sense of national identity in the U.S. The Body of Nations will forefront the voices and perspectives of Indigenous people who for millennia inhabited and sustainably managed the lands that Lewis and Clark traversed, and who contributed richly to the scientific knowledge advanced by the expedition. Your collaboration with botanists, historians of science, partnering organizations like Local Context, and Native Knowledge Inferred, the Academy will bring the story of the 222 plant specimens gathered by Lewis to life through a combination of Western scientific and Indigenous ethnobotanical perspectives to create a compelling, culturally layered view of the remarkable plants of North America. So we applied for an NEH grant. We were just been invited to apply for a Q grant, and that it's as a traveling exhibition. And we're hoping to also have a digital component so that kiosks can also go to sites, over sites that want to go. So the exhibition will show how the herbarium, which features some of the oldest plant specimens in the country, and the ongoing cultivation of heritage plants through agroecology and traditional foodways, safeguards a biodiverse future and sovereignty in an age of species loss and climate change. So one of our main collaborators is ethnobotanist Enrique Salmon. I don't know if any of you know his amazing work. He wrote this book, Iwagara, that is called Kinship of People and Plants, kind of introducing the field of ethnobotany to more general public audiences. He's originally from the Southwest. He teaches at Hayward State. It highlights 50 of the most important plants to Native American cultures with a mix of traditional and Western scientific knowledge. One of the interesting things we did is we took his table of contents and sort of mapped it onto what the plants were in the Lewis and Clark collection and found the areas of overlap. And that was really thrilling. Another key partner is Local Context. And these labels, we should change those how long it's taking as to get these up. Just went up this week. We're just thrilled to have this on the homepage for the Academy, the Opening to Collaborate label. So the local context tools will help enable collaboration. What we're hoping is to co-create the show with Indigenous researchers, cultural keepers to help us interpret the plants according to their histories and foodways. To date, we have loaded 10 plants from the herbarium onto the Local Context hub as well. I'm sorry, our botany collections manager did that. And then we've also added these other labels. So this is our research page. And as I mentioned, the Academy has two main areas of research. One is in field ecology, mostly focused on the waterways of the greater Philadelphia area, as well as in systematics. So, you know, I think some of these practices have been adopted. One of the main great findings at the Academy was Tiktaalik rosé, which was this transitional fish from the Devonian, and that was found in the Canadian Arctic and in Western Patriots. We have a replica of it at the Academy. So I know some of these practices are our scientists follow them, but it hasn't been so systematic. So there's a lot we can learn from this community. And then we've just also put the biocultural label up onto the Lewis and Clark webpage. I just wanted to share a couple more things. Okay, so our methods, we formed decolonizing knowledge, decentralizing the dominant Eurocentric narratives of settlers and colonizers to reflect worldviews, perspectives, and the voices of Indigenous people. Counter narratives, transform the expedition story from a tale of colonial discovery to one of collaboration and visitation, of the Lewis and Clark Party venturing into the territories of sovereign tribal nations that were older, richer, and more complex than the newcomers could fathom or document. Co-creative collaborative approaches, enabling the representation of cultural values and philosophies of contemporary knowledge keepers. Ethnobotanical storytelling, illuminating the multitudinous ways in which indigenous cultures cultivate and use the many plants that Lewis collected during the expedition. So we have formed a Botany of Nations Advisory Council. One of the many special people who've agreed to participate is Susha, founder and other natives, Sean Sherman. Many of you might know his restaurant in Minneapolis. And actually, we thought we just saw him walking down the street. And then this is actually Meriwether Lewis was trained in botany in Philadelphia before he started on the trip. One of his longest journal entries is on the comets route. So I wanted to show you this too. It's like 2 full pages. And it details, where the plant would be located, what kind of conditions you find it in this kind of damp soil. It did really very detailed noticing of the plant structure, as well as the ways that it was cultivated and prepared to make comets root bread. And so, speaking of useful knowledge, could this be useful today? Is our question. So we have, NEH really asks you to describe a whole exhibition, which is very interesting if you're trying to co-create one. So we've kind of set up a framework with the idea that once we actually, when we receive money and can pay collaborators, will this is basically the structure we think could work, but we're going to see what comes of it. So we've identified original specimens and artifacts, something like the Shoe map or holdings in museums like the Smithsonian. The herbarium sheets, we like to actually feature the local context labels to make the public more aware of kind of the collection practices and metadata and all of that. And interactive digital display and film. Here's comments in the field. So what it actually looks like. This is believe it or not, this bread has been preserved at Smithsonian. In a museum. And this is a kind of a rough exhibition floor plan. It has, let's see, when you enter the gallery, this is for the Academy's teacher gallery, which is an art historic reading room. It has an area, the first area is called Nations Meet. The second section is actually it's more about collecting and recollecting, and the third area is about futures, so looking at food futures. And we have talked about 5 different plants being featured: ponderosa pine, tobacco, chokecherry, sage, and comets root that are open depending on where the interest goes. And then I just wanted to show one more image, which is a record floor plan. One of the interesting things is that because we have so much information from the Lewis and Clark journals, we can geolocate the plants. And this would make a really rich interactive experience. So and then we have a short film, is of course, but it's Andreas Bergens, who's a filmmaker who's worked with local context, made this little trailer about our project. So it's, different than the film that you've all seen probably on the Passamaquoddy tribe. And kind of that whole work that they did with the Library of Congress in interpreting the wax cylinders. Ours is just on the sort of beginning of something that we don't know what will happen yet. So it's interesting, I think, for local context, just to follow an institution that's interested in this work, but doesn't really know what it's doing. That's helped with a lot of guidance. So, thank you so much.
I've always seen museums and practice of science as a cultural project. There's certain ideologies that are just embedded by nature into museums, and then other worldviews that are completely left out. Certain things get valued, other things are not valued in those choices that are made of what goes behind the walls of museums. There's an interesting relationship between museum artifacts and a world outside of our doors that's much more holistic, that's related to the land, that's related to cultural practices, that it seems that we could tie these artifacts to in a much more rich way.
Lewis and Clark, which is a famous pair of names, actually have another backstory that not a lot of people know about. It's the science of the expedition. That's what the plants represented. Several hundred plants dried and pressed, put in folders and stored in a nice safe place. Why do we have the plants? Why do we still have them? And what are they used for today? And what was the context in which they were collected that now we can look at with different eyes? You see in more detail the Native Americans are there.
What Lewis and Clark quote unquote discovered is founded upon native knowledge, deep knowledge of a place.
There's a list of all the nations that they encountered. It must number well over 50 or 60. Lewis was immersed in this, talking to the native peoples. He was encountering, learning from them what they did with certain plants, what was useful, what was not. And in some cases, he wrote little notes about what the natives used it for, what they told them about. This is the tobacco which they smoke. This is the tobacco they cultivate. They use this plant by mashing it up and applying some water and putting it on fresh fruits.
We have information, but we have an impoverished record of that exchange that made these herbarium sheets possible. So how do we reintegrate that? What other kinds of information might be added to enrich them? That's what we don't know quite yet, and that's what we're very excited to see.
Thank you. Jamie shared with me something, which is that it's quite something to sit and like this. Quite something to sit with archives and all of the vital cultural data that we've been talking about today. Well, at the same time, sitting with the technological structure behind the movement of these labels. Really appreciative to this panel for giving us a little glimpse of what that nexus is. And yeah, thank you for explaining, giving some clear explanations and applications. A little moment of definition, just in case anyone either here or being like me have looked up some few things. Let's see, URI, unique record identified. API, application and programming interface.
I could be guilty of all.
Business director of content, love chain, and would love to be here. You should be here. That's what I'm about. So hi Molly, nice to be with you. And TK labels, traditional knowledge labels, and the BC labels, the biocultural labels. Oh, and I just want to take a second to lift up this friction, this what was in that slide about do we add friction to encourage that work, or do we eliminate friction to encourage engagement? I'm really gonna be sitting with that in all of our team communities and work going forward. And I'm happy to announce we're gonna have a coffee break right now, 15 minutes. And then we're gonna come back for another stoner panel with Riley and Stephanie and Kyoru. And then we'll be able to have a bit of a bigger discussion, bringing in speaking from this panel and that one. So 15 minutes coffee break. We'll be back at 3.
Oopsie daisy.
Yeah. So if you're like, all right, welcome back, everyone. And I'm gonna hand it over to this amazing people.
Hi, everybody. So welcome back. I am Stephanie Carroll. So see that I have the stuff, that's Stephanie Carroll, to do stuff. I like Tina. I am today from the Native Village of Kitty Call on the Copper River in Alaska. So we run the Copper River Statement. That's where I'm from. And I am at the University of Arizona. And I'm here to talk with Riley and Kilby today and kind of bring the whole conversation back to how do the label with notices through local context and all of these fantastic applications that you've seen today enhance and uplift Indigenous sovereignty, specifically around data. And so I'm going to give some basics because we like slammed right into it, and we'll talk a little bit more about the power of repositories for doing this work, and then some critical issues that we need to think about moving forward. And so I like to talk about data from an Indigenous perspective, thinking about anything that relates to us as individuals and collectives. And we expand beyond the Western definition by thinking about data as basically anything that can be digitized. So today that's information, knowledge, specimens, and so forth. And really it's in these kind of three categories. And so what Indigenous aspirations around data really do is bring us back to thinking about the links between land, and I use land as capital land as they do in what's now known as Canada today, to think about all of the relations around land. So our non-human kin. So that can be water, soil, so forth, about us as people. And then about our worldviews, so our languages. And so weaving together and repatriating, reclaiming, and expressing these relationships between land, people, and language, which are foundational and fundamental to Indigenous peoples. So Indigenous data sovereignty then is the right of Indigenous peoples to govern the collection, ownership, application of their own data. So this really draws upon, as I've had actually more than one tribal elder tell me, making what's old new again. So thinking about those roles and responsibilities and the protocols we have in our communities and translating them into the digital environment. And then leveraging the tools that we have. And so, for instance, local context labels and notices are one set of tools, but also other tools are things like the UN Declaration on the Rights of the Native Peoples, federal recognition, other relationships you might have, to be able to express that. And so Indigenous aspirations around data really work to push back around the norm by thinking beyond the digital context about how do we perpetuate these relationships that we have in this digital environment, and then also beyond the geographic scope of mainstream data sovereignty. So mainstream data sovereignty is really bound by these geographical jurisdictions and nation states, right? But we want to maintain our relationships with our data wherever they may be. And so Indigenous data governance is a way to do that. And so one of the things that we've heard referred to today are the care principles for Indigenous data governance. And these came out of the need to be able to understand and move forward with Indigenous rights and interests as we're moving towards this vast data landscape. And so we have lots of data, we have mandates around open science and open data, and we have the need to maintain and actually increase our relationships with data throughout time. And so the care principle is a collective benefit. So how do Indigenous peoples benefit from data, and how is that benefit built into data ecosystems, data infrastructure, and so forth, and how is it equitable then in terms of being able to benefit from those data on their own terms. Authority to control, which really thinks about rights, governance, so, and the need for data for governance. And the responsibility. And so a lot of people interpret this responsibility as the responsibility of researchers or communities to build and enhance community capability and capacity, but there's a responsibility on researchers and institutions, like we've heard today in a lot of the conversations, to also build up their own capacity and capability to do this work in the right way. But fundamental to this responsibility piece is a responsibility to Indigenous worldviews and Indigenous languages, and making those core and central to the work that's being done. And finally, with ethics, it is a reference to the ethics of the communities. And so the CARE principles are these high-level principles. They're international, global in scope, and they always point down to the community. And so what they're telling you to do as an institution, as a researcher, as a repository, is to establish those relationships with the communities to whom the data that you have or that you're collecting relate to or link to. And so fundamentally what they do is bring to the data discussion, and this was actually by design, the people and purpose of data, so that when we're using other principles like the FAIR principles, which are now everywhere in data. So those principles are to enhance data itself so that it's more shareable. And so it can be seen as being weaponized at times to make open the kind of mantra. But in fact, the mantra is as open as necessary, as open as possible, as closed as necessary. And so we need to remember that. And that is something that even I hear federal agencies say. Because what happens when you get down into institutions, I know at my university sometimes, is that people tell you you have to make your data open because there's a mandate. That's not actually true. The mandate is that you have to do it in relation with the people whose data it is. And so this is a foundational aspect of it. So the CARE principles were put out by the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, which we've heard reference to today, which Maui and I worked very closely with. I'm actually the chair and he's my co-chair by voluntold positions, basically. And so we put out the CARE principles in 2019. And we have two initiatives this year that we've come out with. One is a discussion about the rights that Indigenous peoples express in relation to their data. And so this paper just came out last week, and it's open access. And it talks about these 12 rights, and we bucketed by data for governance and governance of data, and how Indigenous peoples are expressing those rights. And now it's the point where we need to think about what does that mean for institutions, and acknowledge that you're not going to see all of these rights expressed in every situation. And every institution can't handle all of these rights yet. So where do we make movement forward? And then one of the other efforts that we have, and you'll see how this resonates with the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, is really having these broad spectrum advances to promote the rights of Indigenous peoples at a very high level internationally. So we have for the past 3 years, Jane and Maui and myself, and then our friend Camille Callison, has been working with the group at the IEEE, which is the Institute for Electronics and Electrical. They're engineers. In detail, but they're one of the major standard setting bodies for data. And so we're creating the first data standard for Indigenous data. And this is around provenance. And we're at the point of having consultation with Indigenous peoples now through September. And we hope to have this recommended practice out by early 2025. And this is a continued effort to be able to make these very high level movements so that we have uptake at various scales. And so what you have is international uptake. So the UNESCO recognition of open science has the CARE principles in it, and Maui and I are both involved in the efforts moving forward with that about how to assess how that's going. And then you see nation state efforts. So for instance, in Australia, they have the Australia IATSIS Code of Ethics, for any research with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders in Australia, and that includes fair care in it, and is actually a way to refuse research being done if it's not following fair care. And then you get down to the nation state level. So here in the US, one of the rich practices we have are research review boards, but also tribal codes and other tribal policies that clearly set out the standards for interacting with Indigenous research and data on lands. And at this point, I'm going to transition to Riley.
Okay. What has been off the day? So it's time to see Riley taking song. My name is Riley taking song. I'm from Chamorro, which means my homelands are Rabbit Islands, specifically the island of Guam or Guam in the Marianas in the Pacific. I'm a postdoc who has the great pleasure of working with Stephanie Carroll, Jane Anderson, Mara Hudson, and others, especially thinking about implementation of care across different settings. I'm located at the Native Nations Institute at University of Arizona. Okay, so I'm just going to take a few minutes to tell you about some of the projects we're doing now and thinking about really moving care, the care principles from sort of a framework to practice. And the first aspect of this we're going to talk about is the implementation of care data repositories. So right now we have been building a collaboration, a consortium with our use case partners at ASU Collections and also our friends here from University of Maine DDNA. And so we're working together to develop a series of phases for thinking about what does it look like for institutions, for repositories, for researchers to really enter into the work of care implementation in their settings and to do that in a good way. And so we've conceptualized this along a series of 6 phases so far, starting with what we're calling phase 0, which is about institutional preparation. We're calling it phase 0 to really emphasize this sort of foundational pre-work that needs to happen at your institution or repository before you can begin to think about how to implement care. And so some key activities at this phase would include kind of engaging in necessary learning on Indigenous data sovereignty and Indigenous data governance and the care principles. Thinking about how to sort of evaluate and assess your setting for care implementations or readiness. So thinking about what resources you have to implement care, thinking about the technical infrastructure, different existing policies and practices around data sharing and the degree to which those may sort of enable and align with care implementation or maybe the intention with that work. Additionally, we recognize that the work of care implementation cannot be done by any single individual alone. So we really emphasize at this phase establishing some kind of a Indigenous data governance working group or other network of champions and resource folks who can help you kind of mobilize action towards care implementation. And across the different phases, I'll also talk about something we're thinking on, which is kind of scaling considerations. So what does it mean within any of these phases to start thinking about different kinds of levels of scale? Okay, and then so going on to phase 1, this is really focusing on disclosures of rights and interests. So this is, for repositories to leverage key practices and tools to disclose, or in other words, make visible and transparent the existence of Indigenous data within their collections. So different activities that would happen at this phase include the implementation of things like the institutional notices, creation of ethics statements, Indigenous data sovereignty statements, including new Indigenous data sovereignty or governance agreements within your particular setting. And as scaling considerations at this phase include thinking about different infrastructure capacities to kind of carry out these activities. Okay, for phase 2, this is really focused on policies and practices. So thinking about what policies and practices will implement care across your institution or repository, both for data that exists already and new data collections. And so in this stage, we're taking activities like implementation of those statements, different permissioning guidelines, documentation of permissions, redesign of deposit slips, policy briefings, and scaling considerations get into things like provenance, metadata fields, data management policies and flows, and thinking about compliance with the FOIA protocol. Going to phase 3, this is thinking about, especially with the work around repositories, that there's sort of a good fruitful site for intervention for this kind of work because they interface with so many other kinds of data actors and institutions. So phase 3, we're really focusing on integrating the development of those policies, practices, and trainings across those different settings with which repositories interact. So thinking of things like funders, publishers, researchers, universities, metadata fields, and aggregators, and scaling considerations, in this case, thinking about maintaining provenance across aggregators, repositories, as well as the scaffolding of tribal, institutional, and government policies. Okay, and we're still in the process of working with our partners to develop the last 2 phases, so phase 4 and 5, still under construction. But we're realizing the need to build in considerations around sustainability and persistence. So once you have some of these practices in place, what does it look like to really sustain those efforts over time, including when some of those practices may not be sort of mandated by different external entities. So we're starting to think more deeply on this, but here's for action might include different kinds of standards and assessments. Okay, and then lastly, also still in development is thinking about integrating systems across repositories. So building these kinds of broader networks of care, full repositories committed to the application of care, and of course also in conjunction with care, the care principles. Okay, and then the other kind of arm of the work we're doing for care implementation is thinking about building criteria for the care principles. And so this is an effort that we're working with different folks across our kind of different scales of networks. So folks who've been really involved in with Stephanie and others in developing the initial care principles, thinking about how we can develop a criteria to evaluate how those principles are being enacted or implemented in different settings. And so for this work we've been, or others I should say, I just showed up to that very recently, have been in a process of sort of analyzing how these different institutions, different repositories are implementing care on the ground. And this has involved looking at the kinds of statements made from these organizations and institutions about their data management practices with respect to care, and also secondary document analysis. And so we're thinking about taking some of these practices and turning them into different indicators that can then be used to kind of evaluate the degree to which sort of the practices are aligning to the care principles and sub-principles are here on the slide. So I'm just going to give you one brief example of what that looks like, but for the A principle or sub-principle 1.1, for example, is recognizes Indigenous people's right and interest in their knowledge of data. And so the group had been looking at work from LICHI, which is the local indicators of climate change. All right. Observant is something network. All of the acronyms that we have to hold in our brain. So looking at the great work that they're doing at LICHI to enact this principle. So they have a statement from some of their work recognizing that Indigenous peoples have distinct rights under UNDRIP, as Stephanie talked about, and kind of positioning their responsibilities and practices that are in place in their platform to respect free, prior, and informed consent. And so analyzing that, our group is thinking about how we can then translate that into an indicator that can be used to give others examples of how to actually move these principles to practice. Okay, I think we will leave it there and pass it now to Professor Gil Fox.
And I realized that I only have like 10 or 15 minutes, and I was extremely ambitious about the number of slides. So I'm just gonna go all the way. I'm gonna go here. I'm gonna start here. I'm gonna start here. Okay, so this is a plot. I'm a human geneticist. I work in genome sciences, and I'm mostly focused on human genome sequence data. But I wanted you guys to zero in on 2 things. So here we see the vast number of human genomes that have been sequenced by individuals of Western European ancestry.
which, given our healthcare system history of colonialism in this country, should not be a surprise. But the statistic that is far more concerning is at the bottom there. And that is that 72% of these studies have taken place in 3 countries. America, the UK, and Iceland. And yeah, but Iceland was weird, but they have a lot of capacity for students, right? And what's far more concerning when you look at this map and you know a little bit about human history, you'll know that the lion's share of the genetic variation on planet Earth exists in the continent of Africa, specifically. And you can see that all of that information is being outsourced to those 3 countries that we talked to, right? So 72%. That's extremely concerning when we talk about capacity building and building technological independence in a lot of these developing places. And that's a huge focus of a lot of my work. And that information gets commoditized, fed directly into the broken or by design IP system. So here is Lumina. Does anybody know? Well, they are our #1 service provider. They like to think that they're the Apple of genomics. The largest genome sequencing company on planet Earth. They have about a $37 billion market cap. And you can see that since 2018, over 45,000 patents have been filed in this space. Now that is before the largest in mass collection of biospecimens and surveillance data, i.e. COVID. Right, so think about that. This is their headquarters, this is their cafeteria, which is weird. All of these patents that are just up there on the wall like moose heads in a hunting lodge. So you have to think about what the culture there is, what that means. I think this is a testament to how important metadata labeling is, how important this whole initiative is. So I wanted to point to that to say these are the types of things that we're trying to combat with all of these technologies that you hear about all day today. And we also know that data is the world's most valuable resource, surpassing oil in 2018, and that we have an extremely broken supply chain when it comes to DNA, its creation, where it's stored and commoditizes it, and so on. So when you begin to think about it like a resource, you make comparisons with water, oil, timber, rare earth minerals like cobalt, you start to think about it and say, we don't want to recapitulate the previous, historical relationships with any other resource. And if you're from an indigenous community or historically marginalized community, you know what that means. This is looming, that we need safeguarding technologies, that we need deterrent technologies. And look no further than cobalt itself. Now, I choose this example because it's recently been in the news a lot. 75% of the cobalt, which powers the generation of data, because you can't really have the hardware that leads to integrated circuits without this precious resource. 75% of it comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo. Yet this community of people is getting fleeced. Their whole supply chain is broken. Meanwhile, Apple is a $1 trillion company, and this community has, the highest rates of child labor, highest rates of professional sexual assault, all of these things that are really, really horrible. And I would say that supply chain is broken. That's not what we want to see in our space, right? And that's why we made all these images of Tim Cook visiting the Democratic Republic of Congo, which has not happened. And the reason we're doing this is to put pressure on people like this to go and investigate the totality of their supply chain. So the tools we're talking about, and these are images from I think Mid-Journey that we made. The Getty images saying I'm really proud of that thing. But the point is it's like these are the current techniques, right? That's what a lot of the technologies that we're creating here is putting pressure on that whole initiative. And that's why data sovereignty is so important. I'm gonna kind of work through some of this stuff, and I want to get you most important. That data is really important, but also thinking about vertical integration in all of the places where we can enter things. So if you saw Crystal's talk, she talked a lot about how we've built the Native Biodata Consortia and how our focus is on bringing sequencing capacity and everything from the by where we store data to how we process it, all of this is on reservation land, and we need more access to things like this, vertical integration. From the development of the Model T to Amazon, who will literally send a semi truck to your laboratory to pick up your data because it's worth so much money. You have to protect it. You saw that already. A lot of these technologies we've talked about and published on are really interesting because they're in that space as well. And you can imagine using a lot of these tools, these metadata labeling tools to complement that workflow. And that's the hope of a lot of these technologies like the blockchain, that federated learning. But there's a problem with some of these tools, and that is that they generate a lot of data themselves. So I wanted to just kind of expedite those. And so do mobile tools, point of care technology tools. Put this slide in here purposely because I knew my friends from Tahiti would be here and see this. And this is the way that we're kind of working to collect data in different communities. That means we're collecting more data broadly, right? And Pfizer and Moderna know this. They want to bring vaccine notes to communities to eliminate cold chain. But there are consequences to all of that generating data on the fly. Supposedly, we are by the year 2040 going to have generated 150 zettabytes of information. And there are consequences to that, right? It's not just our addiction to data on Instagram or the Internet of Things or ChatGPT. Who's used that recently? And sequencing data. I don't know if you guys saw the new papers. The genome sequencing space came out today, but they are multi-dimensional genomes that have been represented. And that means that, again, it requires more data processing and storage per genome. And there are consequences. And they are not independent of the laws of thermodynamics, which means when you have data centers that store data, they're constantly emitting heat right now, as we speak, as you go to sleep. And this exponential addiction to data is not good for the environment. So we can't sit up here and say, we want to adopt all of these new tools and also be indigenous when we know that indigeneity and sustainability are synonymous. And according to my dad, we're generating so much data that we're cooking the planet. And that's highly problematic. So inspired by some of those ideas, and my partner in crime for this project is named Eric Dawson, who works at NVIDIA, and he's sick today, so he couldn't be here, but he lives in New York, which is sad to be here. But we generated, I don't know, that the bottom plot is the one you should be looking at. And we've generated a new series of predictions and estimates, kind of back of the envelope predictions to say, when is the moment when massively parallel computation itself will surpass combustion engine production of CO2? Will that happen in our lifetimes? And I got into a huge argument with him. Turns out it is going to be in our lifetimes. And it's likely that it's going to be around or before the year 2040. So our attention to detail on our addiction to oil might need to be shifted in a different direction. And we have to think about the new types of technologies that we sponsor in the types of research that we do here. Are we going to be supporting perspectives on Earth-friendly computation? We should be, because this is a looming problem that's going to make every aspect of their lives more difficult. And so I've highlighted a whole bunch of new things. This thing rendered funny, but this is the table that I came up with last night. Who's familiar with NASA readiness levels? Anyone? So when NASA comes out with new technologies, they like to come up with the feasibility. It's like, how far away from this is this on a scale of real to science fiction? Where are we in terms of the application of this? And these are a number of different techniques that can be used to reduce the carbon footprint of computing. Now, we could use initiatives like local context to put pressure on institutions like Amazon Web Services and Google and Microsoft. And I think that's something we should do in the future. And that maybe something that we champion and prioritize. But here you can see there's many different perspectives, and I've included my own estimates of the readiness levels for a lot of these technologies, like, I don't know, sustainable aspects to mitigating heat or saltwater air conditioning, which I learned about when I was at techies, which actually comes from wood. For cooling, or one I put on the bottom, which is very much in the near future, is DNA storage. And this is the idea that you can store DNA in cells, because what is the genome, if not something where you can store data? And in fact, George Church's group just did this, where they stored the first video ever frame by frame in a single cell, and it's really exciting work. So I, being a Hawaiian person, I love breadfruit, ulu from my friends from Tahiti. And I think that we have to find new ways to think cleverly about creating carbon negative computation, and that is sequestering carbon and creating oxygen at the same time. And these might be new techniques to do that. And these are other just crazy ass images of, you see breadfruit on a server rack. But that's not what I mean. But I just wanted to kind of point us in that direction. So we're going to be talking about futurism, and we're going to be operationalizing futurism, and we're going to be protecting our assets. And this is definitely the direction that we should be going. So yes, I'm finished. Thank you.
So Emily and I got to tag teamed in and next discussion was the finalization of the day of a lot of things. Yeah, I feel like today I'm doing it. I feel like today is this, all of the communities and projects and all of these experts and all of us coming together and then out in the world in all these multi-dimensional ways. It's also a theme that I guess, you know, we really wanted to share how much work this is, like how much work is going on, what that change means, what that change looks like, Indigenous futurisms, Indigenous innovation, the shifts within community context, but also how much time it takes and how much energy it takes. And, you know, if there's one question that kind of remains, it's about capacity and about resourcing and how and what can that look like and how can that look differently. Yeah. So just some time to open for questions or responses to both panels that you will come to this afternoon.
I love how this morning, there was a question that came up in how to begin. And I wondered if in the reflection of this morning and this afternoon, I think about young people working in museums right now, and they are so acutely aware of the urgency of this work. And I think of what it means to be a young professional and seeing all this violence that happens in archives and in museums. What advice would you give to someone who sees this, maybe isn't inextricably tied to the work, but sees what's happening? I'm just curious to what advice you might give to somebody who is not speaking at the level of organizational change. They're very entry, but they need to reach for language so that they can help build that change.
I guess trying to think about. I hope they're having fun out there. Like most people is really like Monday. I've worked at exams before. Like organizational sort of jobs, so hopefully they are having fun.
Right, sort of outside, and I work in museums as well, and
I think part, because I don't know the answer, I'm asking the same question, but you have to look for your allies, like in every single department, because it happens a little bit everywhere. And sometimes it's projects and sometimes it's just more basic. And I think that when you have those conversations in the hallway, you can find that, and there's probably more than they think. And I think that that's a really inspirational place to start.
Yeah, I think that's right. One of the things that when I started doing training around Indigenous data sovereignty, one of the goals was really twofold. Actually, to have people feel confident enough to be sitting at a table or walking down the hallway and to bring it up. Just not to be, like to be an expert in their own right, like in their own experience, in their own place. And to be the person who says, when you're sitting around a table and you're talking soil science and there's like 7 people around the table and everybody's going on and on, and finally you say, wait, we're an Indigenous people. Like we're on their land, why aren't they here? And then tied to that is this notion of there's no wrong place to start. There's a bazillion right places to start. And so as part of that, it's you look for your allies and then you look for your opportunities.
Yeah.
And I think, I teach a lot of young museum studies students who are coming into these spaces, and it's also a belief that changes. And having that as one that kind of lead connections. I think some of the work that we've been doing and that Riley and Steph just presented as well, kind of these different phases of change that can happen. And I think that's true for some of the local context work as well, like why we wanted to have projects in process. It's harder to see something that's, that's kind of completed. It's hard to see all the pieces that are being made to make that work. And I think that that's the same in these spaces, that finding those collaborations, but also activating a knowledge that change is going to be changing along the way is also really, really important. Thinking about the continuance of that change as well. So implementation of labor application, must be one step, and what are multiple steps after liberating those things that is some for example, or X.
Because maybe just tap into the documentation. What I immediately think about, when you're presenting this new technology that I'm really kind of excited and terrified by, of like storing data in genomes. But then combining that with what you said before, like this, what would the development of this project look like? Where like the care principles are not something that gets retroactively applied, but is a kind of foundational part of the making of that kind of research. I would love to kind of hear more how something like that would look like if you were, I know it's just in the beginning, but.
I think that's a sentiment that I get from a lot of people that are in this whole community. It's that should be a root of all of the technology. It shouldn't be something that's appended. Like I get the sense that's how we teach people about ethics. Also, it's okay. We 10 out of 10. We're gonna have the ethics lecture or whatever. I feel like that's all too often happening. But yeah, if that's at the root of it, then it'll work out much more profoundly impactful.
I think part of it too is thinking about how if you start at the root and have Indigenous worldviews and even other marginalized worldviews as part of the creation process, what will our technologies look like? What will the infrastructure look like? And how might those be different than what we see today? And so I think, when we created the care principles, the first email I got was from somebody from the EU Parliament, because they were like, oh, we're really interested in this collective notion and the collective rights aspect. Could we just take it and plop it on here and use this? And I was like, if you like this, then you need to, because you need to see what other Indigenous innovations are going to come out and how that can really transform what we're doing.
So like when I think about my own data storage and what I do and how I can be a good citizen to it goes back to having my original data information stored, which is oral storytelling, oral traditions. And so I think thinking about old and new processes, could it be that some of this indigenous knowledge and storage can be useful in a oral language, oral traditional base, where that is not a consumption of energy, but actually energy that could be provided for others. Like you could be talking about language and traditions or history or science by planting a tree. So not only are you interacting and storing knowledge, you're actually creating oxygen as well. So I think there is something to actually keep continuing to go deeper than just what we know now, which is like writing and visual, many other ways to store data, which is audio too, right? So just continue going. Like I said.
Yeah, what we store and how we store it, I think this will be a much less conversation. And I was thinking something very similar in what we store. And how that's a much better use of all of the conversations around land back. Yeah, land back, everybody's doing their we saw the breast dogs land acknowledgements. Yeah. It's like I'm over that stuff. If you want to talk about it, then help us buy some land back. Help us put that in the shepherd. Then it becomes okay, well, we want to build our own cloud computation and we want to store it. Well, then aren't we just a mirror image of Amazon? You know. So we have some big decisions.
This question is for you, because I want to know whether this exhibition will include information about Sacagawea, and to what extent she also helped in the collective and preservation of these places. Did you say?
Right, yeah, I don't know if it's not. I know, I'm sure about different audiences. Yeah, and then there was also your less time as well. I think that's yet to be figured out. You know, I think we kind of again set a framework for what we think this exhibition could evolve to be, but definitely telling those stories. I think you know, you're gonna have to see
This guy is the one that resources. What is the time?
So hopefully we'll find out in August about the NEH grant, and then it's planned for 2026, so we're in 2023. Yes, we'll get to work right away. Yeah.
And I had a question, was there collaboration and informed consent with the Native Nations whose plant knowledge is being made available in the public space?
Yeah, so that's also part of the process, you know, I mean, then now the holdings at the academy, I don't think are don't have consent behind them. So yeah, that will also have to be part of it. Yeah.
And then I'm wondering if part of the exhibit will also talk about plants and appropriation and commodification, like these current issues that Native peoples are seeing today, like, for example, with white sage, how all of this plant is being just like taken away from the community. And even talking about indigenous foods, like, yes, it's wonderful to make all these indigenous foods make it available, but what impact does that have on the Native communities where we have limited land and how to cultivate that? And even where some of those indigenous foods are so precious where they can only be used within the context of ceremony. So also looking at what are the implications of having that knowledge out there, because eventually that knowledge becomes a commodity in this society that we live in today.
Good point. Yeah, and I mean, I think we would have a conference related to this in public programming. So some of the things that are dispersed in parks that include, you know, exhibitions are kind of limited in ways in which what they can explore. So we definitely plan to do some kind of conference rallies. Yeah, good question.
So, Julie, how might local context help protect against the commodification of technology? This is going to be my question. Were there other audiences to comment local contexts?
help, protect against modification
against
of indigenous knowledge, yes.
I think it begins by saying and identifying that there is indigenous knowledge in these spaces rather than assuming that there isn't, which has kind of led to so many different kinds of appropriation in the first place, and to normalize the erasure of indigenous people and indigenous knowledges across all these spaces. That's a lot of work. What the notices try to do is to actually, in the first instance, make transparent the ongoing persistent existence of indigenous knowledge, and then allow for the labels to bring indigenous authority and sovereignty to these spaces, wherein people have to partner, talk, engage with sovereign communities in relationship to the uses of that knowledge. And so it's actually changing the paradigm for what we think knowledge is, where we think knowledge comes from, whose knowledge, and kind of, it's a radical proposition to turn that around. But I think that that's the only way forward. And in many ways, the labels and the notices were brought to try and address the enormity of the appropriation of indigenous knowledges in commercial contexts and in non-commercial contexts. And we started with museums, libraries and archives, and we know how enormous those collections are and how undocumented and how much poor provenance information and poor information about Indigenous people's involvement, let alone their knowledges in the first place. We kind of see exactly the same problems happening in the genomic sciences, in biodiversity, and so kind of what is it to kind of build these spaces back into a conversation with each other that kind of see the kind of core settler colonial logic of erasure playing out, and research and institutional complicity in that. And so I don't know, the labels are just one piece of a larger project against that, but they're trying to bring Indigenous presence into those spaces in a different kind of way, so that people can say, no, I don't want that knowledge used in this way, or that ethnography is not verified by our community. It does not tell you anything about us. And kind of like, what does it mean to control knowledge in a different kind of way that isn't just born out of a certain kind of settler colonial logic of settler futurity.
I think this is partly, or this is exactly what we want to see both from the summit and from this.
And I guess that's why we all do this work, is to try and make that change real. Because our traditional systems of law, for instance, aren't going to get us there. Because they weren't built to do that. They were built to do so. And so, you know, speaking back to the power of legal logics or settler colonial frameworks of separating knowledges and separating disciplines has not really served us very well. And so it's kind of time to try a different way. Yeah.
I'm not gonna be able to quote myself, right? But it's something like fuck the silos and the separations and those determinations kind of against us, because we collectively ensure every worlding that revolves. So I am going to do two last things. I'm going to just thank everybody for coming, for everybody who's online out there, for everybody who's joined us in person to be able to talk about this work and talk about it and share it like in person. It's so important to see each other in person. We haven't been able to do that. This is just the start of being able to do that. Thank Emily for amazing facilitation and for
bringing us and grounding us through all the different sessions of the day. And I wanna bring James Francis in to kind of close us out a little bit. James Francis is another co-conspirator, tribal historian, the director of the Department of Cultural and Historic Preservation of the Penobscot Nation, but also the chair of the Local Context Council. James, I'd just like to invite you up to say a few last words, both on behalf of Local Context and the work that we've been doing, but also being here in the grounding us again.
Amazing. I've been doing this work for a long time. Knowing Jane for more than a decade. And really starting to think differently about how we approach our problems in our Indigenous communities. And really watching local context change over time. And this is truly a summit. Both from what I was watching online before I got here and then what I witnessed this afternoon. It's quite amazing that we came together in this way to share this important work. And it's amazing how much has changed through local context, but also, you know, this idea of what is possible. You know, there's, for me, it really elevates what local context is, because it's those core values of local context. You know, this idea of, you know, priority for Indigenous communities and their sovereignty and their voice that has allowed all these different directions to kind of float around local context and to use and engage with local context in ways that I really don't think that we ever dreamed of. And this is what this summit really truly is synthesizing for me, at least personally. You know, I think it's important to think about, you know, also the amount of capacity that's needed and the work that people are doing in their own little spheres, all with this little kind of connection to local context, because ultimately, again, it's about Indigenous communities and sovereignty. And so, you know, I think when you capture something, an idea that is, for me, really, local context has been really hard for me to define. And I think it's so hard to define because it's so fundamental and so meaningful and so broad and so malleable, and that all of this can happen. That it really doesn't need to be defined. It just is what it is, and people latch a hold of it. And so I just want to thank everybody for participating, whether you're online or in the rooms today at this summit. And again, this is truly, you know, I think of a summit with all these leaders coming together and sharing their ideas. And this is truly what is happening here today. And, you know, I think it's truly, you know, a benefit to local context, how you all have taken a piece of it and brought it forward. And thank you very much. And also, one last thing, join us this evening for a local context film at 6:30 downtown. Where's downtown? Thank you all.